sleet struck Eleanor Muller's face like thrown sand, and she kept walking because stopping would have meant feeling how badly her left heel had opened inside her boot. Covent Garden heaved around her in wet grey motion. Carts groaned, porters shouted, fish scales flashed on barrows under canvas. She held the basket of mended lace against her ribs with both hands so the damp would not creep into the needlework Lady Voss intended to sell at 3 times its worth. Her gloves had split at the fingertips 2 days earlier. Thread ends brushed her skin through the tears in kid leather. Her knuckles burned. Water worked through the cracked seam of her right boot, then the left, each step a cold bite. No one made room for her. Men in greatcoats turned their shoulders and forced her toward the gutter where dirty snow had become brown slush. A woman under a green umbrella glanced once at Eleanor's face and then at her dress. Plain brown wool gone shiny at the elbows, hem dark with wet, and said to her companion, not softly, "Plain thing." The companion laughed as if it were an observation about weather. Eleanor did not look at them. She shifted the basket higher, dark hair clinging to her throat, and tasted iron where she had bitten the inside of her cheek to keep her mouth steady. She had been sent at first light with 12 lengths of Brussels lace to the milliner off Henrietta Street, and told not to return without a receipt. She had stood in the back room while the milliner's clerk counted each piece as though she might steal one by swallowing it. She had waited while ink dried. She had accepted no fire, no chair, no cup. When she stepped back into the lane, sleet had hardened to needle rain. The morning had not improved from there. Her basket was lighter now, but not light enough to forget, and Lady Voss's instructions had followed her like a hand between her shoulders. Return directly, do not idle, and if the lace is damp, you will answer for it. By 10:30, the rain thickened. Street mud climbed the sides of passing wheels and sprayed her skirt. She saw a tea stall under a striped awning, where steam lifted from kettles, and the air smelled of tannin and warm milk. Men stood shoulder to shoulder around the brazier, palms spread to the heat, hats dripping. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the awning, 1 step from shelter. Warmth hit her face in a thin wave that made her knees feel weak. The woman pouring tea looked up. Her gaze settled on Eleanor's hands, then the basket, then the wet hem and patched cuffs. "Coin first." "I have none," Eleanor said. Her voice came out level and too quiet. "I ask only to stand there, 2 minutes out of the rain." The woman's mouth tightened. "Move on, miss. You block paying customers." A man with flour on his sleeve laughed into his cup. "She can warm herself by walking." Another voice added, "Or marry better." Eleanor felt the words strike in their old places. Not new pain, familiar pain. She stepped back into the rain, the steam closing behind her, as if a door had shut. Her stomach cramped hard enough to fold her for a breath. She straightened before anyone could see. She had eaten a heel of bread before dawn in the attic, dry and stale, and given the larger half to the scullion girl who had coughed through the night. Hunger no longer came in waves. It lived in her as a steady, precise ache. The route to Voss House took her past windows where cakes stood in sugared rows and silver lamps burned against the morning dark. She kept to the edges of walls to avoid carriage spray. At Bow Street, a pair of boys raced by and struck her shoulder. The basket lurched. She caught it against her chest before it tipped, and a lance of pain drove up from her left foot so sharply that white sparks snapped in her sight. She did not cry out. She stood still until the sparks thinned. Then she walked again, shorter stride now, left leg stiff. At Drury Lane the rain became sleet once more, small hard pellets that struck her lashes and melted down her cheeks like tears she had not chosen. Her shawl had long since gone through from shoulder to shoulder. Cold slid along her spine. She could not feel 2 fingers on her right hand. She flexed them against the basket handle until pain returned. Pain was preferable. Numbness was dangerous because it made dropping things easy, and dropped things became punishments. When she reached the Strand, the traffic tightened and forced her to pause at a crossing where 2 carriages stood axle to axle. A footman on one box seat looked down at her and smirked. "You are bleeding." She glanced at the stone. A small crescent of red had marked one wet cobble, then diluted and washed away. She shifted her weight so her skirt covered the back of her boot. "Thank you," she said, because there were rules about answering men in livery, and because he was waiting for shame. He leaned farther, amused. "Do they work you to bone at that house?" She met his eyes once, grey, bored, curious only for cruelty. "They work me to utility." He barked a laugh at that, and forgot her as soon as the horses moved. Eleanor crossed with the surge and kept on. The blood from her heel warmed the boot for a minute, then cooled. The leather rubbed. She counted the steps to keep from thinking. 20 to the next post, 30 to the next doorway, 12 to the corner where the paving evened. Numbers were easier than fear. Numbers had edges. Voss House stood on a narrower street, where the facades carried black iron balconies and soot-streaked pilasters, pretending to grandeur. The brass knocker had been polished to a mirror brightness by hands that were not hers. The upper windows glowed pale with daytime fires she did not share. She went to the servants' entrance at the side, not the front, and waited while rain dripped from her hair to the step. When no one answered, she set the basket down carefully, lifted the latch herself, and entered into kitchen heat thick with onions and coal smoke. The warmth stabbed first. Then it settled. Her fingers began to throb. Mrs. Davies, the cook, looked up from a board of chopped turnips and took in Eleanor's skirt, her face the basket. Something like anger crossed the older woman's features and was buried at once. "You are late," said a footman near the range, polishing silver he would repolish after luncheon. He did not look at Eleanor while he spoke. Her ladyship asked twice. "The milliner delayed the count," Eleanor answered. He shrugged. "You can tell her that, if she asks." Mrs. Davies wiped her hands on her apron and set a chipped cup near the back table without comment. Steam rose from weak broth, mostly water and onion skins. Eleanor looked at it. The smell made her stomach twist with longing so sharp it felt like grief. She also looked at the clock above the mantel. 11 minutes to 11. Lady Voss expected the receipt entered before the hour. "Drink," Mrs. Davies said, low enough that the footman could pretend not to hear. Eleanor shook her head once. "If it is found in my hands, you will lose wages." Mrs. Davies's mouth flattened. "Then drink standing by the scullery door and call it medicine." Eleanor lifted the cup. The heat against her palms was almost unbearable. She swallowed twice, 3 times, thin salt and onion and life, then set the cup upside down in the basin and rinsed it. Nothing remained to prove kindness had occurred. She carried the basket and receipt to the morning room where Lady Voss sat by the window in dove-grey silk, a spray of rosewater preceding her like a banner. Her step-cousins, Clara and Imogen, embroidered at either side, all bright muslin and smooth hair and idle fingers. The fire crackled. Eleanor felt the wet in her hem begin to chill again. "You have tracked water on the carpet," Lady Voss said, before Eleanor spoke. "I have brought the receipt from Madame Lenoir, my lady." Eleanor held out the paper with both hands so they would not shake. Lady Voss took it between two gloved fingers and scanned the lines. "You took too long. The roads were crowded." "Roads are always crowded. Efficiency is a moral quality, Miss Eleanor." Clara glanced up, smile thin as thread. "Plain girls must at least be punctual." Imogen did not raise her eyes from her hoop. "She has a talent for delay when there is labour to be done." Lady Voss folded the receipt and handed it to Clara instead of to the secretary's tray. "You will scrub the back stair after supper. You will mend Imogen's blue hem before dusk, and you will not be served at table this evening. I will not reward indolence." Eleanor lowered her head. "Yes, my lady." "Speak clearly." "Yes, my lady." Lady Voss waved her away. Silk rustled. Rosewater lingered. The dismissal was complete. Eleanor turned careful on the polished floor because her left foot had begun to slip inside the wet boot. In the corridor beyond, no fire reached the corners. She paused where the light failed and set the basket on a chest to free her hands. When she drew off the boot, the stocking had stuck to the skin. She peeled it back slowly. The heel was split in a bright, raw crescent. Not deep, deep enough. She pressed the cloth of her petticoat against it until the oozing slowed, then wrapped a narrow strip torn from an old handkerchief around the worst of it and pulled the damp stocking back into place. There were still floors to sweep before noon. There was ash to carry, starch to mix, cuffs to press, and the blue hem waiting like a sentence. She stood for a moment longer in the half-cold passage, one hand against the wall to steady herself, listening to the house divide itself by rank. Laughter in the morning room, clatter in the kitchen, silence in the attic corridor where her single narrow bed waited under a roof that leaked at the seam. Then she put on the boot again, laced it tight over pane, lifted the basket, and went to work where no one would say her name unless guests were listening. She went first to the back stair with bucket and brush because punishment was always time to collide with fatigue, and Lady Voss liked to inspect the treads while dressing for callers. Cold water climbed through Eleanor's split glove seams and found each raw place on her fingers. Lye stung. The ache in her heel settled into a hard pulse that matched the scrape of bristles over wood. Up one step, down one step, wring, scrub, rinse. The house had taught her the rhythm years ago when her father's death still sounded fresh in every room, and condolences still arrived on thick cream cards while Lady Voss measured silver in locked drawers. 3 winters had passed since the fever took him. 3 winters of account books that never balanced in Eleanor's favour. He had stood guarantor for Lady Voss's brother in a shipping venture that collapsed before the ink dried. She had heard the terms repeated in the solicitor's office as though spoken in another language, lien and encumbrance and immediate liquidation, while she sat in a chair too large for her and tried to keep her face still at 19. By the end of that month, the entail had been redirected through petitions she had never been permitted to read alone. Trustees appointed from Lady Voss's circle, and every object in the house assigned a value except the girl who had been born there. The servants learned the new liturgy quickly. In public rooms, she was Miss Eleanor, spoken with polite edges when visitors stood near enough to hear. In passages, she was the burden, the extra plate that vanished from the sideboard, the coat no one ordered mended until a guest might notice the tear. She finished the first flight and began the second, shoulders burning, while voices drifted from below, where Clara laughed at some trifling remark, and Imogen asked whether rose ribbons suited twilight satin better than ivory. Their own maid answered at once, deferential and warm. Eleanor scrubbed until the grain of the wood showed pale and clean, then carried the dirty water out to the yard and returned with fresh before she was called lazy for pausing. When Lady Voss finally appeared at the top landing, silk whispering, rosewater preceding judgment by half a breath, she did not look at the blistered hands or the damp at Eleanor's sleeves. She looked only at a faint streak near the skirting board. "Again," she said, "if one corner is neglected, all corners are neglected." Eleanor knelt and did it again. By the time the hall clock struck 1, she had been sent upstairs with Imogen's blue hem and a basket of mending that had once belonged to her own trousseau chest, now emptied into household rotation as if her future could be unpicked and redistributed by thread count. She worked in the small sitting room that had been her schoolroom as a child, where her copybooks once stood in a neat stack beneath the south window, and her mother had corrected her French verbs in a patient, low voice. Now Clara's hat boxes lined the walls, and Imogen's perfume bottles crowded the sill where Eleanor had once kept pressed violets between pages of Livy. Her mother's portrait had hung above the mantel for 16 years, a dark-eyed woman in cream muslin with one hand resting on a book. Lady Voss had it removed 6 weeks after the funeral, and told the footman the frame clashed with the redecorated damask. The wall remained bare. Even the nail had been pulled. Eleanor bent over the blue silk and turned the hem in precise, even stitches, and as she worked she could hear through one closed door and 2 corridors the scrape of the key in her father's study lock. Lady Voss entered that room herself every Thursday with the steward and emerged with lists. The shelves had been stripped of his law reports first, then the brass instruments, then the atlas he used to open on Sundays and trace trade routes with his finger, while Eleanor sat beside him. What remained now were account ledgers bound in calf and stacked by year, and those were guarded as if they contained state secrets. She had asked once, quietly, if she might recover one personal volume from the desk. Lady Voss had looked at her over the rim of a teacup and said, "Personal possessions are a legal fiction for dependents." The phrase had settled like grit under the skin. Dependence, as if blood and childhood and grief were clerical categories. The stitch bit her finger, and a bright bead rose. She pressed it against the underside of the hem, where it would not show, and kept sewing. At 2, a maid entered to fetch the finished bodice, and stopped at the threshold, uncertain whether to curtsy. "Her ladyship asks if the burden has done with the blue." The girl was young enough to blush when saying it. Eleanor did not punish her for obedience. "Tell her ladyship it is done now." The maid took the folded garment, and hesitated long enough to murmur, almost without sound, "Mrs. Davies saved a crust for later." Then she was gone, and the door clicked shut on kindness, as discreet as theft. Late afternoon drove a dull amber through rain-clouded panes, and with it came the work no one named work. Carrying coal up 4 flights for fires she would never sit beside, polishing the silver épergne for the dinner table where she would stand and not eat, copying 3 pages from the steward's ledger, because Lady Voss disliked Eleanor's hand, yet trusted her sums when money mattered. Those pages contained the shape of the trap that held her in place. A dowry allocation under Clara's name, a second under Imogen's, an annuity to Lady Voss's brother contingent on household efficiencies, a line item marked Maintenance Miss E.M., reduced quarter by quarter, until it would soon vanish entirely. She had seen enough arithmetic to understand intent. Keep her fed at the edge of weakness. Keep her clothed at the edge of shame. Keep her too occupied to seek counsel and too poor to leave. Unmarried, obedient, economically, invisible. She copied each figure exactly and set the sand shaker down with careful hands. Outside the study door, 2 footmen carried out a narrow mahogany escritoire that had belonged to her mother, carved with laurel leaves along the lid. One of them shifted his grip and muttered, "Auction lot tomorrow." Eleanor stepped back into shadow so they would not have to stop and explain. At dusk she laid the dining cloth in the front room while guests arrived in glossy carriages and shook rain from cloaks worth more than her year's keep. Lady Voss received them beneath chandeliers and spoke of charitable subscriptions, of civic duty, of the moral necessity of discipline among the lower orders. Eleanor moved behind chairs with tureens, silent as furniture. Once, when she set broth near Mr. Pelham from Lincoln's Inn, he glanced up and said, "Your niece is pale, Lady Voss. You keep too many obligations under one roof." Lady Voss smiled without warmth. "Miss Eleanor thrives on useful employment." Laughter answered. Eleanor's throat tightened once, then cleared. She served the next course. No plate was laid for her when the household sat to its own supper below stairs. Her punishment held. Mrs. Davies passed her in the scullery, and without looking directly at her, slid the promised crust and half an apple into Eleanor's apron pocket. Eleanor touched the cook's sleeve in brief thanks and went on stacking plates until the last dish had been rinsed. Night settled fully by the time she climbed to the attic corridor with her candle guttering and her left boot stiff from dried blood. The roof seam above her bed had begun to drip again where last month's patch failed. She shifted the wash basin under the leak and listened to the measured plink of water in metal. One scuttle of coal a week had been allotted to her room since Michaelmas. She had learned to bank it for the coldest nights and sleep in her mantle on the rest. Tonight she didn't light the grate. She set down the candle, unpinned her hair with fingers gone clumsy from chill, and stood a moment while the house settled around her, distant laughter from lower floors thinning into creaks and muted doors. Then she took from beneath her mattress the small ring of keys she had pieced together over months from cast-off blanks and patient filing. One opened the west corridor door if turned half and lifted slightly. Another caught on the old cabinet lock near the linen press. She moved through darkness she knew by count, past shuttered windows and a disused nursery, until she reached the narrow hall Lady Voss kept closed for no reason she ever named. The portrait waited at the far end above a console table, half in shadow, gilt frame dulled by neglect. A child stood at a window in the painting, dark hair tied with plain ribbon, face solemn, eyes too large for the small bones beneath them. 6 years old, perhaps 7. Paint had preserved what life had spent. Eleanor lit no second candle. She breathed on a corner of her apron and wiped dust from the lower edge of the frame in small, careful strokes, then from the child's painted sleeve, then from the glass where the corridor grime made the features blur. She did this twice each week when she could steal 10 minutes and no more. Her father's oldest friend had painted it 20 years earlier, and after his death the canvas had vanished in the inventory sales, only to reappear years later in rumour, purchased at auction by the Duke of Halcroft and hung in his London hall. Lady Voss had acquired this smaller study after, refusing to explain how. Eleanor had never seen Halcroft House. She had never spoken to the Duke. She knew only that a powerful stranger had kept the image of an unnamed child for 2 decades, while the child herself learned to pass unnoticed in her own home. She set her fingers lightly against the frame, a gesture so brief it could be denied, and turned back at once when the corridor boards gave a soft answering creak behind her. The board creaked again. Eleanor turned with her hand still on the frame and saw Lady Voss standing at the mouth of the corridor with a candle held high, silk wrapper spilling pale silver over the boards, rose water sharp even in the draught. Clara stood 1 step behind her, cloak thrown over a nightdress, curiosity bright in her face like cruelty waiting for shape. For one strange second no one spoke. The candle flame bent. Wax slid down Lady Voss's thumb, and she did not flinch. Then her gaze dropped to Eleanor's hand, to the dust-marked apron, to the ring of copied keys half hidden in Eleanor's other palm, and the silence ended cleanly. "Thief," Lady Voss said, very softly. The word moved through the corridor like a blade drawn from cloth. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten hard against her spine. "I stole nothing, my lady." Lady Voss advanced until candlelight cut across Eleanor's face and left the painted child in shadow. "You break locks in my house at midnight and call it nothing." Clara gave a small laugh that failed to conceal excitement. "Search her room now. I said she watched our things." Eleanor closed her fingers over the keys once, then opened them and held the ring out. "These open only this door and the cabinet by the linen press. I made them to clean where no one else is sent." Lady Voss's eyes narrowed. "You made keys?" "Yes. You confess skill in forgery and trespass." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I confess dusting a portrait." Clara stepped past Lady Voss and looked up at the painting. "This old thing again. She speaks to it sometimes." She said it for effect. Lady Voss did not look at Clara. She looked only at Eleanor, and in her face calculations settled into place. "You are right to value portraits," she said. "Paint survives where girls do not." She took the keys from Eleanor's hand with sudden force, metal scraping skin, then caught Eleanor's wrist and turned it so the fading yellow mark at the base of her thumb showed in the candlelight. "Even now you bruise like weak fruit, and still you resist simple instruction." Her grip tightened until pain flashed up Eleanor's arm. "You will dress before dawn. You will attend me to Holborn posting yard. You will carry a sealed letter to Halcroft House and place it in the butler's hand before noon. If you fail, your attic key is surrendered and your boxes are put into the street by sunset." Eleanor's pulse stumbled at the name. "Halcroft!" The portrait seemed suddenly heavier behind her, as if the painted child had leaned nearer to listen. "Why Halcroft House?" she asked before caution could silence her. Lady Voss smiled without warmth. "Because I require a witness to your obedience." Clara leaned close enough for Eleanor to smell wine on her breath. "If she refuses, may I have her winter mantle? The brown one is nearly decent." "If she refuses," Lady Voss said, "she will not need a mantle." She released Eleanor's wrist. Colour rushed back in a hot sting. "Sleep, if you are able. You walk at 5. Then she turned, silk brushing the wall, and the candlelight withdrew down the corridor, taking heat with it. Clara glanced back once, pleased, then followed. Eleanor stood alone in the dark passage, with the portrait at her shoulder, and the shape of the command pressing against her ribs. Safe places in that house had always been temporary. Tonight, even this narrow corridor had been claimed and spoiled. She touched the frame once, quickly, not prayer and not farewell, then went back through shuttered rooms and up the attic stair with her empty hand throbbing where the keys had been. By 5 the next morning, rain tapped a slow pattern on the mews stones, and Eleanor stood behind Lady Voss's hired carriage with a parcel basket at her feet. The bruise on her wrist turned from yellow to violet under thin skin. The city had not yet gathered full noise. Milk carts rattled. A bell sounded somewhere near the market and was swallowed by mist. Lady Voss arrived wrapped in plum velvet with sable at her throat, Clara and Imogen behind her in travelling cloaks that had never known repair. None of them looked at Eleanor until the driver cracked his whip and the carriage lurched east. Then Lady Voss passed a narrow envelope through the open-facing seat without meeting Eleanor's eyes. Thick cream paper, red wax seal stamped with the Voss crest. "You will not break it," she said. "You will not speak unless addressed. You will go where I direct and nowhere else." Eleanor took the letter with both hands. "Yes, my lady." The carriage smelled of wool, perfume, and damp leather. Her own skirt steamed faintly as it dried in patches. At Chancery Lane the wheels hit a rut, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from gasping as her heels struck wood. No one noticed. No one wished to. Holborn Posting Yard opened ahead in a churn of mud, harness bells, shouts, and restless horses blowing white breath into the wet air. Carriages queued under a long timbered shelter, while ostlers ran with blankets and buckets. Lady Voss descended with Clara's hand on one side and a footman on the other, as if crossing a courtyard were a ceremonial act. Eleanor followed with the basket, reins sliding from the shelter edge down the back of her neck. They had come to change teams before proceeding to a musicale in Bloomsbury. That much she gathered from scraps of conversation around her, names of hostesses and musicians, and the magistrate expected to attend for some charitable announcement. Lady Voss paused beneath the shelter, drew the same sealed letter from her reticule, and thrust it back into Eleanor's hand, as though contact itself displeased her. "Holcroft House, front entrance. Place this in their butler's hand and return to Voss House by the service route. Noon." Her eyes dropped to Eleanor's boots, already wet through. "If you are late, the attic is closed." Eleanor tucked the envelope inside her shawl. "I understand." "Do you?" Lady Voss's voice lowered. "You have one value left to this household, Miss Eleanor. Convenience. Do not misplace even that." She turned away at once, calling for Clara to lift her hem clear of muck. Eleanor stepped back into the yard, calculating distance, traffic, and time, when a shout split the noise from the east gate. A bay horse tore through the entrance riderless, reins whipping, eyes rolled wide. Men leapt clear. One trunk cart tipped and spilled rope and parcels into the mud. The horse slammed a wheel and veered, iron shoes striking sparks from stone before an ostler caught the trailing strap and dragged the animal into a post with both arms locked. In the same burst of motion, a travelling carriage near the far wall rocked hard as its matched team reared against the pole. A door flew open. Inside, a small figure in a dark coat pitched sideways against the frame, then stilled, one hand to his brow where a bright line of blood had started under damp hair. Two footmen stared from the step and did not move. One crossed himself. The other shouted for a surgeon and looked nowhere near the child. Eleanor was already running. Mud splashed to her knees as she reached the carriage. The boy was conscious, blinking hard, frightened more than hurt, blood tracking down the side of his face from a shallow cut at the hairline. "Look at me," she said, climbing halfway in without permission. "You are safe. Keep your hand here." She pressed his palm gently over the cut and felt him obey at once. "Do not lean back. Forward. Good." The footman found his voice behind her. "Miss, step away. His Grace will—" "Then fetch clean linen," she snapped, sharp for the first time, "and brandy, if there is any in the case. Now." The footman hesitated one heartbeat too long. She reached for the carriage rug, tore a strip from its edge with both hands, and folded it into a pad. "Hold this firmly. Yes." The boy's lower lip trembled. "Am I dying?" "No," she said. "You are angry and sticky and alive." She angled his chin towards the light to check his pupils, then steadied him as the carriage shifted again. Rain hammered the roof. Voices surged and broke outside. She heard boots strike stone with decisive force, and a man's voice cut through the yard, low and carrying. "What happened?" It was not a question asked for comfort. It was a demand for fact. The footman straightened as if a wire had pulled them. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She kept pressure on the improvised pad and counted the boy's breaths. 1, 2, 3. Even enough. Then a shadow fell across the doorway, and she looked up into a face she knew from rumour and from no room she had ever entered. Tall, rain-dark greatcoat, open at the throat, shoulders broad enough to block half the light, hair black with wet, jaw set hard, and at his left temple a pale scar that dragged slightly when he tightened his teeth. His eyes were not cold in the way gossip preferred. They were precise, storm grey and unsparing. He took in the scene in a single sweep. The boy, the blood, the torn rug in Eleanor's hands, her soaked shawl, her split glove, the bruise on her wrist, the red at the back seam of her boot where old injury had reopened in the run. His gaze returned to her face and held. "You," he said. Iron on stone. "Hold pressure. Do not faint." Eleanor's spine went rigid at the command, at the rank in the cut of his coat, at the way every man in the yard had gone still around him. "I am not fainting, my lord," she said, breath short but steady. "He needs linen and quiet. The cut is shallow. He was jolted." The boy reached toward the man with his free hand. "Papa." The word landed with more force than the shouted names around them. Duke of Halcroft, Gabriel Ashford. The name moved through Eleanor's memory with the portrait behind it. 20 years of a painted child in a stranger's hall, and for one unguarded second she forgot the letter under her shawl and the deadline ticking toward noon. Halcroft stepped onto the carriage step and braced one hand on the frame, close enough that rain from his coat sleeve struck her knuckles. "Jonas, eyes on me!" His tone changed by a narrow degree. Still command, less blade. The boy obeyed. "Does your head spin?" "A little. Any sickness?" "No." Halcroft glanced at Eleanor without moving his head. "Your assessment." She answered at once. "No deep wound, no loss of consciousness that I saw. He is frightened. Keep him sitting upright. No jostling for 1 hour." A yard surgeon arrived, breathless with a case in hand, and stopped short when he saw her in the carriage. Halcroft did not look at him. "Confirm," he said. The surgeon bent, checked quickly, and nodded. "The lady is correct, Your Grace. A clean dressing and rest." Halcroft turned then, finally, fully, to Eleanor. Up close he looked carved from weathered stone, but there was strain at the mouth, a restraint so tight it read as stillness. "Name." The question struck her harder than any shouted insult in Covent Garden. She opened her lips and closed them again. Behind him, beyond the shelter, Lady Voss stood near her carriage with Clara and Imogen gathered like pale birds at her sleeves, watching. Eleanor saw recognition flare in Lady Voss's eyes, then calculation. She also saw, with sick clarity, that the sealed envelope had slipped from her shawl in the scramble and now lay on the carriage floor near Halcroft's boot, wax crest turned upward for anyone to read. "My lord," a footman said urgently from below, "Lady Voss requests your attention. She says that woman is in her employ and has caused a scene." Halcroft did not turn toward the voice. He kept his gaze on Eleanor and spoke as if there were no other person in the yard. "Name?" "Eleanor Müller," she said, because there was no shelter left in silence, and because Lady Voss was already moving towards the carriage with ruin in her face. Rain drummed on the roof above them. Halcroft's eyes held hers for one measured beat, then dropped to the fallen envelope near his boot. He bent, lifted it between 2 fingers, and turned the seal toward the light. Red wax. Voss crest unbroken. The yard noises seemed to pull away from the carriage, as if distance itself had stepped back. "My letter," Lady Voss called from the mud, voice sharp enough to cut through harness bells. "Miss Eleanor was sent on an errand. She is prone to melodrama." Jonas flinched at the raised tone. His hand shifted from the blood-soaked cloth. Fresh red welled at his brow. Eleanor moved at once, pressing the makeshift pad back into place, guiding his elbow with steady fingers. "Keep your head forward," she murmured. "Do not look down. Breathe slowly." Halcroft did not pass the letter down. He spoke without looking away from his son. "Linen." A footman thrust folded cloth upward. Eleanor took it, dipped one corner in brandy from the surgeon's flask, and cleaned the cut with careful strokes. Jonas hissed and gripped the edge of the seat. "I know," she said. "It stings because you are alive. Hold still." Lady Voss reached the step, silk cloak darkening at the hem where rain struck. Clara and Imogen lingered behind her under the shelter, pale faces intent. "Your Grace," Lady Voss said, and her voice changed instantly to polished concern. "I regret this disorder. The girl is under correction. She has a taste for attention. If she has distressed the child, I will remove her now." Eleanor felt the old reflex rise in her throat. Apologize, withdraw, disappear. Jonas's fingers found her sleeve and clung. She kept her hand where it was and did not move. Halcroft turned his head at last. "My son is holding her sleeve." Lady Voss smiled, as if he had made a charming remark. "Children cling to novelty. He will forget in a moment." "I do not forget," Jonas whispered, still bent forward. His voice shook, but the words were clear. "She stopped the blood." The surgeon cleared his throat, hat dripping in his hands. "That is accurate, Your Grace. The lady acted swiftly." Lady Voss's gaze flicked to him. Irritation flashed and vanished. "How fortunate!" Eleanor tied the clean linen around Jonas's brow, firm but not tight. She checked his pupils again against the grey light. Equal, reactive. His breathing had slowed. Her own hands had begun to tremble from cold and from the effort of holding still under 3 sets of watching eyes. She folded them in her lap for a moment and pressed her thumb into the split seam of her glove until feeling steadied. Halcroft held out the sealed envelope to her. "You are carrying this." "Yes, my lord." "For whom?" "For your butler at Halcroft House before noon." She lifted her chin. "By Lady Voss's order." Lady Voss made a soft sound, half laugh, half warning. "You see how she dramatises simple domestic tasks. Miss Eleanor confuses instruction with persecution." Eleanor looked at the wax seal, then at Jonas, then at the rain running off the carriage roof in silver lines. If she took the letter now and stepped down, she might still cross Holborn in time. If she moved, the boy would twist after her. The dressing would slip. Fear would return to his face in a rush she recognised too well. She could not do it, and still believe herself decent. She met Halcroft's gaze. "I will deliver the letter when he is settled, not before." Lady Voss's voice sharpened to a whip crack. "You will obey me now. Step down." Eleanor did not step down. The yard had gone watchful. Ostlers paused with bridles in hand. A coachman stood frozen on his box, reins hanging slack. Rain hissed in the mud and nobody spoke for several breaths. Halcroft's expression did not change, but the line of his jaw hardened over the old scar. "You issue commands in my carriage, Lady Voss." "I reclaim my servant, Your Grace." Her smile thinned. "She has already overstepped." "She is not overstepping," Jonas said, voice smaller now, exhausted and stubborn. "She said I was angry and sticky and alive." For the first time something moved at the corner of Halcroft's mouth. Not warmth, not amusement, recognition of precision, perhaps. He looked at Eleanor again, taking in the wet shawl plastered to her shoulders, the blood dark at her left boot, the purple mark on her wrist where Lady Voss had gripped too hard. "Did you break this seal?" he asked, holding up the letter. "No, my lord." "Did you delay to pry into its contents?" "No." "Why are you bleeding through your boot?" The question landed with brutal directness. Lady Voss cut in before Eleanor could answer. "She is careless. She injures herself for sympathy." Eleanor heard herself speak, low and even. "I walked from Covent Garden in sleet this morning with millinery lace. The heel opened on the Strand. I have not had leisure to mend it." Halcroft's gaze did not leave her face. "And still you ran to a stranger's carriage." "Yes." "Why?" She almost said because no one else moved. She almost said because children should not have to ask whether they are dying while men debate precedents. Instead, she answered with the plainest truth, "Because he was hurt." Lady Voss gave a brittle laugh. "She enjoys moral speeches when she should be silent." Halcroft turned to Lady Voss with quiet finality. "You will lower your voice." The words were not loud. The effect was immediate. Clara's colour drained. Imogen looked at the mud by her shoes as if it might swallow her. A fresh gust of rain drove under the shelter. Jonas shivered hard enough to rattle his teeth. Eleanor stripped off her own soaked shawl and tucked it around his shoulders beneath the carriage blanket, trapping heat at his chest. The fabric was cold and threadbare, but it blocked the draught. She rubbed his hands between her palms until his fingers loosened. "My lord," she said, without looking up. "He should be moved somewhere warm within the quarter hour. Slowly, no jolting, dim light. If he sleeps, wake him once each hour until evening." The surgeon nodded before Halcroft spoke. "Sound advice." Lady Voss snapped open her fan with unnecessary force. "Am I to understand my household is detained indefinitely because Miss Eleanor has appointed herself physician?" Eleanor could feel the trap opening beneath every word. If she answered sharply, Lady Voss would call it insolence. If she bowed and apologized, Jonas would hear that care was a transgression. She kept her voice level. "You are delayed by an accident, my lady, not by me." Lady Voss's eyes flashed. "Liar!" The word hung in damp air. Halcroft's head turned slightly toward Eleanor's hands, still red at the knuckles, where lie and cold had cracked the skin. "Liar!" he repeated. But he was looking at Lady Voss. "The child's blood is on her sleeves, not yours." No one answered. By the time the yard clock struck the half hour, the rain had eased from hard sheets to a fine, needling mist. Halcroft gave orders in clipped phrases. A groom brought a steadier team. The surgeon rode ahead to prepare at Halcroft House. 2 footmen were dismissed from immediate duty and replaced without argument. Lady Voss stood in the mud and watched authority move around her, useless as an ornament in a storm. Eleanor rechecked the bandage. Clean. No renewed flow. Jonas's eyelids drooped, then lifted when she said his name. "Good?" She asked him the day of the week, his age, and the name of his pony. He answered each one, slower each time but accurate. When she asked if the road was tilting, he shook his head. "Does your stomach turn?" "A little. Keep breathing, small breaths." He obeyed. She had seen frightened children in fever seasons go rigid with terror because adults lied to them in polished tones. She did not lie. She gave him tasks. It gave him ground to stand on. Halcroft watched all of it from the carriage step, one gloved hand braced on the frame, rain drying in dark streaks on his coat. He spoke only once while she worked. "Who taught you?" "My father read medicine badly and confidently," she said before she could stop herself. "I learned to correct him from the margins of his books." A flicker crossed his face at the word father. Then it was gone. Lady Voss mounted one step, ignoring the mud on her hem. "Your Grace, this farce has gone on long enough. Miss Eleanor carries sensitive correspondence and has no legal standing to remain in your vehicle. Return my letter and release her." Halcroft extended his hand toward Eleanor. "Give it to me." She drew the envelope from inside her bodice, where she had tucked it dry against her stays, and placed it in his palm. The seal remained intact. Her fingers brushed his glove for a bare second. Cold leather over controlled strength. He looked at the crest, then at Lady Voss. "I will receive it now." Lady Voss froze. "It is addressed to your butler." "It has reached my hand. State your objection." She had none she could voice without exposing intent. Eleanor saw the moment calculation failed. Lady Voss folded her fan shut with a decisive snap. "None, Your Grace. I trust your discretion." Halcroft slipped the letter into his coat. "Good." He turned to Eleanor. "You will ride to Halcroft House." Lady Voss answered for her. "She will return with me." "No." He did not raise his voice. "My son will not be handed between carriages for your convenience. She is my dependent. She is the person he will permit near him at present." Halcroft's gaze dropped once more to Eleanor's boot, then to the bruising at her wrist. "And she is injured?" Lady Voss's nostrils flared. "You overinterpret household discipline." Halcroft's reply came like a door closing. "I do not interpret. I observe." Eleanor felt the sentence in her bones. "Observe, not pity, not rescue spoken sweetly. Fact named aloud where others pretended blindness. It unsettled her more than open cruelty. Cruelty had rules. This did not." Lady Voss tried one final angle, voice softening to injured dignity. "Your Grace, you place me in an awkward position. Guests await me in Bloomsbury. Miss Eleanor's absence will cause comment." Halcroft held her eyes and said nothing for long enough that Clara shifted and looked away. Then he spoke. "Then tell your guests the truth. A child was hurt. A woman prevented harm. Your schedule survived." Colour rose high in Lady Voss's cheeks. She stepped down from the carriage and nearly slipped in the mud. A footman caught her elbow. She jerked free at once. "Very well," she said. "Keep her for an hour if you insist. She is to be returned by dusk." Eleanor knew the phrasing was deliberate. Keep her. Returned. Property disguised as propriety. She kept her face blank. Halcroft did not acknowledge the demand. He signalled the driver. Wheels shifted. Harness jingled. The carriage began to roll out from the shelter, slow enough to spare Jonas jolts. As they turned through the yard gate, Eleanor saw Lady Voss standing where they had left her, silk spattered to the knee, rose-water wasted in wet air, eyes fixed on Eleanor with a promise colder than rain. Inside the carriage, motion steadied into a careful pace. Cobblestones thudded under the wheels. Jonas leaned against Eleanor's shoulder and closed his eyes. "Do not sleep yet," she whispered. "Talk to me. What is your dog called?" "Mercer." "What colour?" "Black. Too fat." "Good. Tell me 3 things Mercer steals from the kitchen." He managed a weak smile and listed bones, dripping pudding cloths, and once a whole pie. She kept him talking through 2 streets and one crowded crossing where cart wheels screamed against stone. At the next turn his head drooped again. She woke him gently, asked his name, asked hers. He answered both. Halcroft sat opposite, knees braced wide for the movement, hands bare now that he had removed his gloves. There was a pale line across one knuckle, old and healed. He watched her question his son with the same relentless attention he had brought to the yard, but silence had shifted around him. Less aggression, more strain, as if restraint itself cost him. At length he said, "You defied your employer in public." Eleanor kept her eyes on Jonas. "I delayed obedience. There is a difference. Lady Voss will punish it." "Yes, my lord." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes." He leaned back a fraction, gaze still fixed on her. "Most people choose safety first." She thought of the tea-stall awning, the denied warmth, the laughter. She thought of Mrs. Davies turning a cup upside down so kindness left no evidence. She thought of a child asking if he was dying while grown men waited for rank to speak. "Safety is not always available," she said. "Sometimes only choice is." The carriage rolled on through grey light. A church bell marked the quarter hour as they crossed toward the west, and by then Jonas's answers had slowed to one word at a time, but remained clear. Eleanor adjusted the shawl around him again, hiding the worst of its frayed edge beneath the blanket. Halcroft's gaze followed the movement. "That shawl is ruined." "It was ruined already." He did not answer. His hands closed once over his knees and opened again. When Halcroft House came into view, its stone frontage dark with rain, and its iron railings black against the pale street, footmen were already waiting at the steps. The carriage stopped with a soft lurch. Halcroft rose first and held out his arms to Jonas. The boy tightened his grip on Eleanor's sleeve. "She comes." Halcroft paused, then inclined his head once. "She comes." He looked at Eleanor, and the command in his voice had altered by a degree too small for anyone else to hear, and too clear for her to mistake. "Stay with him." Stone steps rose beneath her as if the house itself were bracing for impact. Eleanor followed Halcroft through the black front doors while rain slid from the eaves in steady cords behind them. Warmth met her first, then light, then the sharp scent of beeswax and cedar from polished panelling. The entrance hall was vast enough to swallow echoes. Footmen stood in 2 lines near the walls, rigid and alert, their eyes fixed on the Duke's face and then dropping startled to the woman in a soaked brown dress at his shoulder. Jonas made a small sound against Halcroft's coat. "Do not leave!" Eleanor moved closer at once. "I am here." Halcroft did not slow. "Open the west morning room. Build the fire high. Send for doctor. Anning," again, his voice cut cleanly across the marble. "Now!" A butler stepped forward, silver hair neat as wire, expression disciplined into neutrality. "At once, Your Grace." Halcroft turned his head slightly. "Mr. Pike, this is Miss Muller. She remains with Master Jonas." The butler inclined his head to her, the smallest acknowledgement, but in this house it landed like a formal declaration. "Miss Muller." No one at Voss House would have spoken her name in that tone with no audience to impress. They crossed the hall. Her wet boot slipped once on the marble, and pain tore through her heel so sharply that her breath caught. Halcroft's gaze dropped without warning to her step, then returned forward. He said nothing. His silence was not ignorance, it was record. The west morning room had already been opened when they entered, shutters pulled back to grey day. Coals rattled to flame. Halcroft laid Jonas on a long settee near the fire and knelt in front of him, so their eyes were level. "You will answer every question put to you," he said. "If you feel sick, you say it at once." Jonas nodded, pale and game. "Yes, Papa." "Good." Eleanor moved to the side table and found a basin, clean cloths, and a cut-glass decanter of water waiting as if prepared by instinct. She re-wet the dressing, checked the wound line, and pressed gently around the edges for swelling. Jonas flinched, but held still. "Any new spinning?" she asked. "No." "Any bright sparks in your sight?" "No." "Good." The doctor arrived within minutes, rein on his shoulders, spectacles fogged from haste. He examined Jonas with methodical care, asked the same questions she had asked, and drew back with a grave nod. "Concussion risk remains mild if he is kept quiet, Your Grace. No carriage movement, frequent waking, simple broth later." She was right in the yard. Halcroft's gaze shifted to Eleanor for one measured beat. Not surprised now. Confirmation. Dr. Anning began opening his leather case. Eleanor saw the labels on 2 small vials, Latin script slanted and cramped. Without thinking, she reached for the gentler tincture. "Not that one first," she said. He has an empty stomach. The doctor paused, then looked closer and gave a short nod. Correct. Halcroft's eyes narrowed, attentive rather than suspicious. You read medical Latin. My father owned books, a misplaced confidence, Eleanor said. I learned both could be hazardous. It was the nearest thing to dry humour she had allowed herself in months. It passed quickly. Jonas closed his eyes and her hand went to his wrist at once to wake him again. Jonas, stay with me. He opened his eyes obediently. I am awake. By the time the long case clock in the hall struck 2, the first urgency had eased into a thinner, more dangerous quiet. Jonas lay propped by cushions, skin less ashen, pulse steady under Eleanor's fingers. The room had warmed enough that steam lifted faintly from her damp sleeves. Her own body had begun to shake in small, involuntary currents, from cold spent and hunger returning with teeth. She hid her hands in her skirt folds. A maid entered with a tray. Broth for Jonas, bread, tea, a second covered plate. She set it down, curtsied, and retreated. Halcroft, who had been standing near the mantel with one hand braced against the stone, spoke without turning. Eat! Eleanor stared at the tray. My lord, I am here for the boy. You are here because I ordered it. His tone did not rise. It did not need to. He turned then, and she saw how rigidly still he had kept himself, as if movement might break a surface he was holding shut. Eat, he said again, then continue. She lifted the spoon for Jonas first. He swallowed 2 careful mouthfuls and grimaced. Tastes like rainwater. Then it is medicinal and noble, she said, and coaxed a 3rd spoonful. When he settled back, she reached for the bread on the edge of the tray, intending to tear one small piece and hide the rest. Halcroft spoke before her fingers closed. All of it, she looked up. My lord. All of it, Miss Muller. The command froze her for a breath. No coaxing, no soft concern, no permission to refuse in politeness. Protection disguised as rule, delivered in the only language he seemed willing to speak. She ate because he had given no graceful path around it, and because her vision had begun to blur at the edges. The first swallow hurt. The second steadied. By the third, heat returned to her hands. Jonas watched, heavy-lidded. Papa never tells guests to finish bread. Miss Muller is not a guest, Halcroft said. The words struck the room and hung there, ambiguous and irreversible. Eleanor set the crust down carefully. Then what am I, my lord? Halcroft held her gaze. Necessary. No one spoke for several breaths. Fire clicked in the grate. Rain ticked against the glass. Eleanor felt her pulse in her throat, too quick, too loud, and looked down to adjust Jonas's blanket, though it did not need adjusting. A knock sounded at the door. Mr. Pike entered, expression composed. A messenger from Lady Voss, Your Grace. He requests immediate release of Miss Muller to return before dusk. There it was, the chain tugging from miles away. Eleanor rose half an inch from her chair. Halcroft lifted one hand, and she stopped without deciding to. To whom is the request addressed? Halcroft asked. To Your Grace, verbally. Then give him a verbal reply. Halcroft's voice was flat as winter water. Miss Muller remains under my instruction until Master Jonas is stable. She leaves when I dismiss her, not before. Mr. Pike inclined his head. Yes, Your Grace? And Pike, Halcroft's gaze hardened. No further messages from Lady Voss reach this room unless they are written and signed. Yes, Your Grace. The butler withdrew. The latch clicked. The room settled again. Eleanor sat very still. You place yourself in conflict with her for no gain. Halcroft looked at her, as if weighing each word before allowing it out. I'm already in conflict with anyone who leaves a bleeding child unattended while discussing propriety in a posting yard. She will say I manipulated the scene. She says many things. His eyes dropped, unsparing, to her wrist. Facts remain. He stepped closer, stopped at the edge of the carpet, and spoke with brutal precision. Your right glove is split to the knuckle. Your left heel is bleeding through wet leather. You have 3 healing bruises on your wrist, 1 older bruise at the elbow, and lie cracks across both hands. You came to my house with no mantle worth the name and no food in your stomach. The words did not sound like accusation. They sounded like indictment, and not of her. Do not tell me again that Lady Voss merely disciplines you. Eleanor's throat constricted. She forced it open. If I say otherwise, what then? His jaw tightened over the scar at his temple. Then I act. The answer was too direct to bear. She looked away first, to the far wall where a tall gilt frame hung between 2 sconces. The portrait. It was larger than rumour, the paint deeper, the child's face grave and intent, dark hair tied with plain ribbon, 1 small hand against a window ledge. 6 years old, maybe 7. Her father had stood behind the painter that day and made foolish suggestions about posture. She remembered because he had laughed when corrected, and because her mother had brought sugared almonds in a folded paper for Patience. The memory hit so suddenly she had to grip the chair back to steady herself. Halcroft followed her gaze. You know that portrait? She could not lie. Yes. How? It was painted in this house before the auction sales. She swallowed. A study was kept in the west corridor at Voss House. I cleaned it. Halcroft's expression altered by a fraction, a deepening focus, as though pieces long separated had shifted into place. You touched the frame in the yard. She turned sharply back to him. You saw that. I see what is in front of me. It was not vanity. It was method. Jonas stirred and made a small, unhappy sound. Eleanor moved instantly, touched his shoulder, spoke his name until his eyes opened again. She asked him where he was. He answered. She asked the year. He answered after a pause. She asked if light hurt. He nodded once. Curtains half, she said quietly. Halcroft crossed the room himself and drew the drapes to soften the glare. He did not call a servant. He returned to his place by the settee and remained there, 1 hand on the carved wood near Jonas's ankle, not touching, present. Minutes passed, then more. Dr. Anning returned, rechecked pulse and pupils, approved the quiet, left fresh instructions, and departed. The house moved around them in muffled currents. Eleanor lost track of the quarter hours and measured time by Jonas's breathing, by the cooling of tea in the cup untouched near her elbow, by the way Halcroft did not leave even when papers were brought to the door for signature. He signed against the panel and sent them away without stepping into the corridor. At one point Jonas drifted fully asleep, and Eleanor began to rise, careful not to disturb him. Halcroft said, Sit. He sleeps. And you are shaking. She looked down. Her hands had begun again, fine tremors she could not command away. She sat. He moved to the sideboard, poured fresh tea, and set the cup within her reach. His fingers brushed the rim first, testing heat like a man checking a weapon before use. Then he stepped back, distance restored. Drink. She obeyed because resistance cost too much, because he had learned the shape of her refusals and cut around them. When the hall clock struck 4, a second message came, this one written. Mr. Pike brought it on a salver and remained at the threshold. Halcroft broke the seal, read, and his mouth flattened. She claims you stole household papers and requests I detain you for questioning until her solicitor arrives, he said. Cold slid through Eleanor even in the warm room. She has begun, then. She began years ago. He folded the letter once. This is merely her first written mistake today. He handed the paper to her. The hand was Lady Voss's, sharp and slanted, accusations dressed as concern, demands dressed as legal necessity. Eleanor read every line and felt a strange calm settle beneath fear. Written meant traceable. Traceable meant vulnerable. Halcroft watched her finish. "Did you steal anything?" "No." "Can she prove otherwise?" "She can produce servants willing to swear as instructed." "Can you produce facts?" "Yes." Eleanor looked up. "If given access to ledgers she keeps locked." A pause. Then he nodded once, decision hardening. "You will have access." The promise landed with more force than any declaration could have. Not comfort, leverage. Jonas shifted again, waking, confused. Halcroft was at his side before Eleanor could stand, one broad hand braced on the settee back, body angled to shield without crowding. "I am here," he said. Jonas blinked up at him. "You did not go." "No." Eleanor watched father and son in profile against the firelight. Halcroft's face remained controlled, almost severe, but he had not moved far from that settee for hours. Not for papers, not for food, not for rank. Stillness as confession, because he had no softer language. Jonas turned his head toward Eleanor, then back to his father. "She stays tonight?" Halcroft's eyes lifted to Eleanor. The room seemed to narrow to that look alone. "No," she said before either of them could speak. "If I do not return, she will strip Mrs. Davies of wages and turn 2 maids out to prove authority." Halcroft went very still. "You are certain?" "Yes." "Names?" "Mrs. Davies, Martha Reed, Anne Pike, no relation to your butler." He absorbed each name as if entering terms in an account that would be settled in full. "You will write them?" "I have no wish to hide them." "Good." He took one step closer. Close enough that she could see the fine exhaustion at the edges of his eyes, the scar pulling faintly when he clenched his jaw, the restraint that had become its own kind of strain. "When you return," he said, each word deliberate, "you do not go alone. You do not sign anything. You do not enter a locked room at Lady Voss's request. If she raises a hand, you leave the room and send for Pike." He held her gaze. "Those are not suggestions, Miss Mueller." The command settled over her like a cloak she had not asked for, and could not quite refuse. She had lived too long without protection to trust it easily. Yet he had seen what others ignored, named what others denied, and set his authority against hers without bargaining for gratitude. Eleanor inclined her head once. "I hear you, my lord." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something smaller and more dangerous. "See that you also obey." Eleanor held his gaze and felt the command settle into her like a lock turning. Then the door opened, and Mr. Pike said, "Your Grace, the magistrate from Bloomsbury has arrived with officers, and Lady Voss is below, demanding Miss Mueller be surrendered at once." By the time the hall clock struck 5, Eleanor stood in Halcroft's front drawing-room, with her wet hem drying stiff at the edge of the carpet, Jonas asleep upstairs under Dr. Anning's watch, and Lady Voss in plum velvet facing the magistrate with her fan shut like a weapon. Clara and Imogen stood behind her, jewelled and pale. Martha Reed, the young maid from Voss House, shook near the door with 2 footmen at her shoulders and a velvet pouch of pearls in an officer's hand. Lady Voss did not bow to Eleanor. She addressed the magistrate as if she were heir. "The maid stole from my jewel case before guests at Lady Penrith's musical. I requested the Duke's assistance only because this girl," she flicked her gaze toward Eleanor, "has a known history of trespass, and has misled his household all afternoon." The magistrate, Mr. Bellamy, was an older man with rain on his cuffs and patient eyes. I received 3 competing statements in 1 hour, Lady Voss. I would prefer facts in an orderly sequence. Halcroft stood at Eleanor's shoulder, not touching her. He had removed his greatcoat. The scar at his temple was stark in the lamplight. "You will have them," he said. Martha made a small sound. "I did not take them, sir. I swear it." Lady Voss turned on her. "Be silent." Eleanor stepped forward before fear could calculate cost. "Do not silence her." Every face in the room shifted toward her. Her hands were steady now. She reached into the inner seam of her cuff and drew out a folded scrap of paper, soft from being hidden and re-hidden. "I took this from Lady Voss's writing desk 3 days ago when I was ordered to copy household accounts," she said. "I expected I would be accused of theft soon." "I kept proof." Lady Voss's voice sharpened. "You confess burglary." "I confess survival." Eleanor handed the paper to the magistrate. "It is a pawn ticket from Brindle and Company, Drury Lane. 2 strands of river pearls pledged under the name C. Voss this morning, 1 hour before the musicale began." Mr. Bellamy unfolded it under the lamp. His brows lifted. "Constable." The officer nearest the door took the pearl pouch, opened it, and compared clasp marks against the ticket notation. "Match, sir." Clara gave a thin gasp. Imogen closed her eyes. Lady Voss's fan trembled once and stilled. "Forgery," she said. "These people conspire." Mr. Bellamy looked up, voice still even. "The broker's seal is pressed in wax and ink. We can confirm by runner within the hour." Halcroft said, "Send one now." An officer left at once. No one else moved. Lady Voss shifted tactics with visible effort. "Your Grace, this is grotesque. That girl has turned your house into a stage." Halcroft's reply was quiet. "You brought the stage with you." Mr. Bellamy held out his hand to Eleanor. "Miss Muller, you stated earlier that Lady Voss sent written allegations." Halcroft drew the folded letter from his coat and placed it in the magistrate's hand. "Received at 4 o'clock. Signed." Bellamy read in silence. The room heard only rain at the panes and Martha's breathing. At length he said, "This requests unlawful detention of Miss Muller without warrant and asserts theft without inventory record." Lady Voss's chin lifted. "I was protecting my household." "From whom?" Bellamy asked it. "The woman who fed your accounts and mended your clothes while you reduced her maintenance by the quarter?" Eleanor felt that line strike. Bellamy had read the copied ledger pages already. Halcroft had sent Pike for them within minutes of her naming the locked books. The butler had returned with the steward's duplicate daybook and Eleanor's own fair copies in her hand from that afternoon's work. A knock came. The runner from Brindle and Company was admitted, soaked and breathless, with the broker's ledger wrapped in oilskin. He confirmed the pledge under Clara Voss's initials, made at Lady Voss's instruction, witnessed by her coachman. Clara whispered, "Mamma," without sound in it. Bellamy closed the ledger. "Lady Voss, you are charged pending formal filing with fraud, coercive dispossession and theft by false accusation. You will surrender keys and account books tonight." The words landed like stone in water. Clara began to cry soundlessly. Imogen did not move. Lady Voss looked at Eleanor then, truly looked, and what had always been contempt became fear. "You will regret this," she said. Eleanor met her eyes. "No, I will remember it." Bellamy turned to Martha. "You are released from accusation. Your wages are to be paid in full." Martha's knees gave. One of Halcroft's footmen caught her elbow before she fell. The officers took Lady Voss's reticule first. From it came the copied keyring Lady Voss had ripped from Eleanor's hand in the west corridor. Bellamy held it up. "These," Eleanor answered, "made to open a sealed corridor and linen cabinet only, not jewel cases, not exterior doors." Bellamy nodded and logged them. returned to Miss Muller unless needed for court demonstration. A second officer collected the Voss household key bundle from Lady Voss's glove. A third received the pearl pouch, pawn ticket, accusation letter and broker ledger as evidence. Every item had a place, a hand, and a record. 3 days later, under a hard blue sky that made the city look carved and brittle, the seizure was executed at Voss House. Eleanor stood in the front hall, where she had once been sent out by the side door, and watched officers carry out account chests while neighbours paused on the pavement to stare. Mrs. Davies stood near the kitchen arch with her apron folded tight in both fists. Martha and Anne Pike waited beside her with travel bundles and disbelief. Lady Voss descended the stair in black silk, no rosewater, no fan, no audience that would rescue her. "You bring guards into my house," she said to Eleanor. "No," Eleanor said. "You did that yourself." Bellamy read the order aloud. Title privileges curtailed pending judgment. Assets frozen. Residence transferred to trustees until fraud accounting concluded. Clara and Imogen were permitted personal effects only. The old mahogany escritoire marked for auction was carried back inside at Eleanor's request and entered to the Muller estate inventory for audit. Lady Voss paused at the threshold, searching for one face that might yield. None did. Even the footman who had once laughed at Eleanor's bleeding boot looked at the floor and stepped aside. After the carriage bearing Lady Voss turned the corner, Eleanor climbed to the attic one final time with a constable and Pike behind her. She took her single box, her father's worn Latin text recovered from a locked crate, and the attic key that had been used like a leash. She set that key in Bellamy's palm. "I abandon claim to this room," she said. "Noted," he answered and wrote it down. By the first week of November, the audit table at Halcroft House was covered with ledgers, petitions, bonds and receipts, and Eleanor sat at its head because she had asked for that right, and Halcroft had put it in writing before witnesses. Mrs. Davies received 12 months' wages and a pension stipend from recovered funds. Martha and Anne were contracted into Halcroft service under protections Bellamy drafted himself. The West Corridor study portrait from Voss House was delivered in straw and canvas and hung temporarily in the library until placement could be decided. That evening, when signatures were done and candles burned low, Halcroft stood with Eleanor in the long hall where the larger childhood portrait had hung for 20 years above the console table. Opposite it now, newly cleaned and reframed, hung her mother's portrait in cream muslin, with one hand resting on a book. The two faces regarded each other across polished stone. Jonas, colour back in his cheeks, ran one careful finger along the air beneath the frame and looked up at Eleanor. "You were both children in this house and no one told me." "No one told me either," she said. He nodded as if that made complete sense and went to find Mercer, who had indeed stolen a kitchen bone. Silence settled after he left. Firelight from the adjoining room touched the gilt frames and the edge of Halcroft's jaw. He spoke without looking away from the portraits. 20 years, and I never asked your name." She turned toward him fully. "You asked in the yard." "You asked as a commander demands a report." His throat moved once. "Then I ask now as a man who intends to deserve the answer." She held him there for a long breath, measuring not warmth but steadiness. "Eleanor Muller," she said, "daughter of Matthias Müller and Eliza Müller. Not burden, not dependent, not convenience." He inclined his head, formal as oath. "Eleanor Müller." On the table behind them lay the marriage contract Bellamy had reviewed that afternoon. No debt clauses, no guardianship transfer. Separate property retained. Mutual consent, revocable before vows. Her authority over the Müller audit continued after marriage. She had written each condition herself. Halcroft had signed without amendment. She rested her fingertips on the final page. "I will not be rescued and owned." His answer came at once. "You will be asked and answered." She picked up the pen, signed, and sanded the ink. He signed beside her name. Pike and Bellamy witnessed. Mrs. Davies, invited in from the doorway with wet eyes she refused to wipe, added her mark as household witness. When the papers were sealed, Halcroft did not reach for Eleanor. He stood beside her, close enough that she felt the heat of him through wool and candle air, and waited until she chose to move. She did. One small step, enough to place her shoulder near his sleeve while they faced the two portraits and the life that had finally been named in full.